So my name is Jess Bailey. My pronouns are she and her. And for visual accessibility, I am a young white woman seated in a home office in front of a bookshelf, wearing glasses with short brown hair and wearing a brown sweater. And I'm a PhD candidate in the history of art and medieval studies departments at UC Berkeley. And I'm currently a Mellon Research Fellow at Wellcome Collection here in London. I am honored to be co-organizing our gathering tonight with my colleague, Felix Jaeger. This public lecture is culminating a research exchange which has been generously supported by colleagues at the Wellcome Collection and the Warburg Institute. Before we introduce our distinguished guest, I will mention just a few practical matters. We're using the captioning function on Zoom tonight should you want to activate it on the bottom of your screen. The chat feature on Zoom will be turned off during the lecture, and we ask that you hold your questions and comments until we open the Q&A portion of tonight's event. Any ableist or other harmful behaviors will not be tolerated in discussion. The lecture is being recorded. However, the Q&A portion of the event will not be recorded. Well, it will be recorded because of the nature of recording, my apologies, but then it will be removed from the YouTube sort of long-term broadcast of this. And the YouTube channel on the Warburg's Institute will host this lecture for the future. So over to you, Felix.
Hey there, everybody. Thank you, Jess. My name is Felix. I'm very excited to be here and to co-host tonight's evening lecture together with my very good friend and colleague, Jess. For visual accessibility, I am a white man in his mid-30s wearing a brown shirt and speaking to you from the Warburg Institute in London. I am currently a postdoctoral faculty member at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. However, today's event grew out of a long-term commitment that I embarked on with Jess when I was still part of the international research group Bilderfahrzeuge, which is situated in Hamburg and Berlin, as well as at the Warburg, where I used to be located. The Warburg inspired and generously supported the development of this project, and I'm grateful to Bill Sherman for extending his backing even beyond my tenure in London. I would also like to give my thanks to Claudia Wiedepohl, the Warburg's archivist, as well as the members of the Bilderfahrzeuge, in particular Steffen Haug, for providing such massive help in putting this workshop together from afar, especially under the circumstances of the ongoing pandemic. Last but not least, as always, many thanks to John Millington for his untiring organizational help.
Tonight's lecture is culminating a strand of research exchanges, meetings, and collaborations between myself and Felix and many of you in attendance tonight, between our two London institutions, which share a commitment to changing understandings of the history of science and medicine. Like many academic projects during the pandemic, we have adapted to changing circumstances and have moved many aspects of our collaboration about disability material cultures online. Some of you may have attended our lecture series, which we hosted online earlier this year, where we learned from disability researchers Elizabeth Bearden, Emily Koch, and Bianca Frona. If you did not catch these lectures, please do check the Warburg Institute's YouTube channel for the recordings. While previous lectures in this sequence focused on the pre-modern history of disability material and visual culture, we conclude tonight with a lecture which brings us back to the 19th and 20th century, when these deeper histories were being collected and replayed in interesting ways across the changing cultural imagination of disability, alongside the reality of the lived experience of disability, especially in the aftermath of World War I. With the support of the research development team at Wellcome Collection and scholars at the Warburg Institute, we have spent the last 2 days examining collection and archival materials that evidence the importance of the pre-modern history of disability to later turn of the 20th century discourse. Unlike many museums, medieval and early modern disability has been very consistently exhibited at Henry Wellcome's Historical Medical Museum, now known as Wellcome Collection. This breadth of institutional history presents a rare opportunity to study shifts between the medical model of disability, the social model, and into current discourses of anti-ableism. Simultaneously to Henry Wellcome's intense late 19th century collecting practices in the history of medicine, Abby Warburg was developing theories about visual culture and the body that, while not immediately relevant to disability studies, actually present provocative avenues to explore, especially in terms of how historical images were being positioned in the early 20th century climate. It is our hope that more research will emerge that not only studies disability art and culture within a variety of situated periods, but also considers the historiography of disability and its various political stakes and productive provocations for the field of art history.
Thank you. There are very few researchers who can span vast amounts of historical time as deftly as our guest tonight, Dr. Suzannah Biernoff, has done in her work. Dr. Biernoff is a reader in visual culture at Birkbeck, University of London, and the recipient of several prestigious grants for her work on visualizing illness and discourses of pain. Her publications focusing on histories of the body, medical history, and ways of seeing include Sight and Embodiment in the Middle Ages, and Portraits of Violence, War and the Aesthetics of Disfigurement, and I will not enumerate all of the various wonderful essays you've written. Dr. Biernoff's publications have left a very strong impression on us, and her thoughtful guidance these last 2 days has brought new inspiration to reconsider the interplay of history and historiography in disability studies. The more Jess and I consider visual histories of disability, the more we are convinced that our research must attend carefully to the moments in the historical record where social and political upheaval, such as the 2 world wars, turn attention back from the present to the historical record of disability. Whenever the perception of disability has shifted, history has served as a background that provided inspiration for the worse or for the better. Dr. Biernoff's lecture tonight will take up this issue in terms of disfigurement, a word which has a long-standing presence in medical, anatomical, as well as art historical analytical discourses. She will discuss how in context of war and violence, disabled bodies and disfigured faces are especially burdened with meaning. They become symbols of nationhood and allegories of loss. Thanks to the large number of facial casualties, and that is a weird wording, returning home from the battlefields of World War I, plastic surgery, described by the pioneering surgeon Harold Gilles as a strange new art, became a recognized medical specialism. Part of the ideological project of post-war reconstruction, the work of facial repair occupied artists as well as surgeons. Drawing on her 2007 book, Portraits of Violence, which I recommend to everybody, Dr. Biernoff will reflect on the legacy and durability of some of these ideas and the coincidence of art and medicine in images of the war-damaged body. The lecture this evening is titled Disfigurement, a Cultural Anatomy. I will now hand over to Dr. Biernoff, and after that, Jess is so kind to host the Q&A. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Biernoff.
Thank you so much, Felix and Jess, for that lovely introduction and for organising just an absolutely amazing workshop, which I have enjoyed. I have learned so much, and actually I feel, I've become acutely aware of how much I don't know. But it's really rare actually to have these opportunities to talk to historians working in different periods about questions and concerns and interests that we have in common. So I really do feel, and I've said this a couple of times, I feel like this is the beginning of a conversation that has a long way to go. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so you should now be able to see my PowerPoint slides. And I'll just introduce myself as well for visual accessibility. I am a 53-year-old white woman. I was going to say with brown hair, but actually it is increasingly grey. And I am sitting in my office at Birkbeck, University of London. So a while ago, I was invited to contribute to a 6-volume Bloomsbury series on the cultural history of beauty. Along with the other 5 contributors writing about physical difference, I was given some questions to think about. How have concepts of beauty been used to discuss differences between groups of people based on social status, class, race, etc.? How have concepts of the ugly and the unsightly shifted over time? What is the relationship between ugliness and other concepts such as evil, degeneracy, and immorality? What is the relationship between beauty and presumed morality or ideas of goodness? While I was wondering where to start, I came across a short article by Laura Barton, who's a Guardian journalist, about the acne positivity movement. It included a link to a YouTube video by the British blogger M. Ford. Ford had been doing online makeup tutorials for several years after developing adult onset acne, sharing images of her face with and without makeup, on social media. Her video, which she titled "You Look Disgusting," is a response to some of the comments she received. And it's only 3 minutes, I'm going to play it. It has music, but no speech. And what I'm going to do is just read out some of the comments as we come to those. She mentions that over 100,000 people Just pause that there. So why does acne and the non-normative body generally provoke such strong emotions and opinions? And it's actually the first time I've read out the comments, and it's quite upsetting to have to read them out. How did we get here? What are the roots of the contemporary politics of appearance? So what I decided to do in my chapter for this Bloomsbury series was to tell a story, a necessarily partial story, about how beauty and ugliness have been mobilized and politicized, and even, it seemed to me, weaponized in the modern period. My staging posts were provided by historians, sociologists, artists, photographers, and literary scholars who've considered appearance in relation to disability, illness, and stigma. Beginning with Susan Schweik's landmark 2009 book, The Ugly Laws, which investigates the impact of the so-called unsightly beggar laws passed in a number of American cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Rather than focus on a particular aspect of my research today, I thought it might be interesting to talk about some of these imaginary interlocutors, the texts and images that have made me think differently about disability, provoked questions, and found their way into my teaching and writing. Although I'll be concentrating on modern material, these sources hint at continuities with the more distant past and illuminate moments of transition or rupture. They allow us to talk about a history of disability across the longue durée, but they also reveal the specificity and limitations of the very term disability. Physical appearance has probably always been bound up with ideas of moral worth and social value. But in Zweig's book, we see appearance politics at work in the everyday lives of men, women, and children who, in the absence of a welfare state, relied on begging and peddling as a means of survival. Her writing shines a light on the political utility of aesthetic judgment and taste, and also on the social dimension of apparently subjective emotions like aversion and disgust. This is in itself a modern move on Zweig's part, irrevocably linking the personal, physical appearance, feelings, and the political. But in the modern world, ugliness is tethered to ideas of normalcy, perhaps even more than it is to ideas of beauty. We live in a world of norms, Leonard Davis writes in the opening chapter of the Disability Studies Reader. Each of us endeavours to be normal or else deliberately tries to avoid that state. Although normal and abnormal are pervasive concepts today, concepts with intricate social, legal, and medical ramifications, normalcy itself is a relatively recent invention. The term normal entered the English language around 1840, and the idea of the norm coalesced in the decades that followed. Before this, we find the equally pervasive concept of the ideal, which Davis defines as a mythopoetic body, a body that takes its inspiration from classical art and literature. But as Davis explains, the ideal is primarily understood to be an attribute of gods, not ordinary mortals. This imagined ideal transcends the particularity, imperfection, and flux of individual human bodies. The emergence of the normal body as an object of study and regulation coincides with the development of statistics in the 19th century and underpins the modern understanding of disability. Davis makes two crucial observations about this statistical revolution. One is that almost all of the early statisticians had an interest in eugenics. The other is that the norm or average became a new ideal. As the Belgian statistician Adolphe Quetelet put it in 1836, an individual who epitomized in himself at a given time all the qualities of the average man would represent at once all the greatness, beauty, and goodness of that being. What Quetelet offers here is a statistical vision of enlightenment, civilization, and beauty, a world where perfectibility means ever diminishing deviations from the norm. There's nothing especially modern in the tendency to see individual beauty and health symptomatically, as visible signs of the health and beauty of the soul, the social body, the city, the nation, or the race. What is new in the modern era is the bureaucratic means through which individual and civic improvement were pursued. These themes eddy through the unsightly beggar ordinances that is the subject of Zweig's book, which begins with Chicago's infamous version ratified in 1881 and finally repealed in 1973. Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in this city, shall not therein or thereon expose himself to public view under the penalty of a fine of $1 for each offence. Like the ugly laws passed in other American cities, which were ostensibly aimed at controlling street begging, the Chicago City Code presents the sick, the disabled, and the itinerant poor as human litter, unsightly or disgusting objects rather than people. As hospitals, asylums, and other state institutions gradually replaced almshouses and poor farms, city authorities began to separate their poor from their crippled and feeble-minded, and I'm using historical terminology here. Remove from public view, the diseased, maimed, mutilated, and deformed of the ugly law were subjected instead to the professional scrutiny of doctors, psychiatrists, pensions officials, and government statisticians. Pointing to the declining popularity of the freak show over the same period, Rosemary Garland-Thompson argues that modernity deemed disability an improper object to be looked at. In 19th century London or New York, you would have encountered corporeal anomalies on crowded city streets, in travelling fairs and circuses, in museums and sideshows. These remarkable, entertaining, and ordinary encounters with bodily difference were gradually displaced by new forms and sites of physical display in the 20th century. From the horror movie and the documentary photograph to the museum and the archive. In the fall of 1916, Paul Strand took a handheld camera to the working class and immigrant neighbourhoods of Manhattan's Lower East Side. He started at 5 Points, the slum that social reformer Jacob Riis had photographed in the 1880s. Taken at close range with a shallow depth of field, Strand's portraits are both intimate and anonymous. This image, one of his most famous, records an act of stealth, or perhaps it is an act of theft, because the woman clearly hasn't sensed the presence of the photographer right in front of her as the shutter releases. Her face is as impassive and weathered as the granite wall she stands against. A painted tin sign declares her blindness in capital letters. She isn't unkempt or dishevelled. A few strands of hair are tucked beneath a wool scarf, and she wears her New York City peddler's license like a silver brooch fastened to her winter coat. Blindness in Strand's photograph is a metaphor for the holy grail of documentary photography, the photographer's ability to see without being seen. On the jacket cover of Zweig's book, it provides a silent and probably unintended commentary on the project of historiography, which relies just as much on a non-reciprocal gaze. Our subjects, people like this blind woman, can't look back or turn away, and we're always on the verge of being caught staring. As natural symbols, bodies and biological processes acquire collective meaning, and forms of bodily regulation and control symbolize and enact social control. Garland-Thompson suggests that extraordinary or anomalous bodies in particular function as magnets to which culture secures its anxieties, questions, and needs at any given moment. Yet to speak of difference or disability in general terms is always to risk obscuring the specificities of experience and history. Deviations from the norm are not consistently stigmatized, and some bodies acquire a greater symbolic burden than others as bearers of cultural meaning. One of the key determining factors in the modern period is whether a body is deemed to be able or disabled. North America has had disability compensation for injuries sustained in military service since the Civil War. The 1890 Disability Pension Act extended this right to any veteran unable to work, whether or not they'd been incapacitated in active service. Disability is a modern idea. In the United States, its emergence coincides with the rise of the ugly law and the decline of the freak show. But it's not simply the case that 19th century freaks became seen instead as people with disabilities. These were radically different ways of dealing with difference, argues Nadia Durbach in her historical study of British freak shows. The significant distinction was between those who could work and those who couldn't because of illness or incapacity, the blind, the crippled, the feeble-minded, the infirm. And again, I'm using the terms that would have been used at the time. Although, as we've seen in Strand's photograph, the existence of peddlers' permits blurred the line between the able-bodied and the disabled, and between work and charity. Freak performers, because they worked for a living, were able-bodied and often promoted as exceptionally able. They were objects of curiosity, amazement, even admiration, not pity or distaste. An 1899 advertisement for Barnum and Bailey's London show, for example, described the performers as, quote, superior persons, gifted with extraordinary attributes not apparent in ordinary beings. And I've taken that quote from D'Urbach's book. In Britain, the term disabled gained traction during and after the First World War. And unlike the earlier idea of infirmity, it implied a duty of care towards the war wounded. In 1918, the global task of human restoration was staggering. 752,000 British servicemen were left permanently disabled. In Germany, the official tally was more than 1.5 million. Even in the United States, which entered the war in 1917, the number of veterans registered as disabled was significant, with 200,000 recorded in 1920. It's no wonder then that the body of the disabled war veteran became an overdetermined signifier in the first half of the 20th century and has continued to be a contested aesthetic and political site in the post-9/11 era. Sacrifice, patriotism, loyalty, bravery, endurance. These concepts do their cultural work when they are personified and embodied. Disfigured or disabled, the veteran's body can be used to express the hollowness or failure of these cultural ideals, a theme most famously pursued in Weimar Germany by the artists Max Beckmann, Otto Dix, Heinrich Höhler, and George Gross. In Gross's hands, ugliness is an aesthetic weapon, a means of puncturing the rhetoric of German militarism and national reconstruction. Featured in the catalogue of the International Dada Fair of 1920, this is a portrait of the rehabilitated war veteran as prosthetic man, a persistent theme in Weimar art and literature. Most anti-war art of the 20th century has tapped into the same rich theme of political caricature as Gross's Uncle August, with its exaggerated visual lexicon of the grotesque. In contrast, propaganda and commemorative art typically draw inspiration from a familiar iconography of heroism and sacrifice with roots in the classical and Christian traditions. The ideological and aesthetic tensions that war reportage and commemoration involve are well illustrated by Brian Adams' images of British veterans with life-changing injuries, they were published in a photo book by Steidl under the title Wounded, the Legacy of War. An exhibition of these photographs was timed to coincide with Remembrance Day in 2014. This black and white portrait of Joe Townsend filled a wall in the first room, his powerful upper body contrasting with a pair of compact mechanical legs. By then, Townsend was a leading member of the British para-triathlon squad. In an interview for the project, he remembered how he used to walk down the street and notice people staring. Like many people, he credits the London 2012 Paralympic Games with changing public perceptions of disability. Since 2012, blades and other non-naturalistic prosthetics have become more functional, more visible, and more beautiful through their association with elite sport and fashion. But Adams' photographs of disabled veterans mingle the rhetoric of patriotism with pathos. The most striking thing about Joe Townsend's portrait, if you happen to be an art historian, is that his pose recreates one of the most famous works from Roman antiquity, the Dying Gaul, in the Capitoline Museum. The sculpture immortalizes a Gallic warrior in his dying moments. Blood wells from a wound in his chest, his sword lies broken beside him, and his strength visibly ebbs away. This is the beautiful suffering of the classical tradition that continues to console in the 21st century. Antiquity, as the historian James Porter observes, is a seductive affair. Its mythologizing is charged with desire. Anna Carden-Coyne has shown that classicism provided artists, politicians, and citizens with an aesthetics of healing in post-World War I Europe and America, a vision of beauty, integrity, and harmony to ameliorate the ugly reality of industrialized warfare. She traces this embrace of classical beauty through war memorials, dance, gymnastics, women's fashion and cosmetics, bodybuilding, and innovations in plastic surgery and prosthetics. I think it can be seen in Adam's photographs too. The figures have a monumental, sculptural quality that is even more apparent in the large format exhibition prints. Filigreed with scar tissue and inscribed with tattoos, they perform feats of agility, display medals and missing limbs, smoke and salute. The pristine uniformity of military dress, worn in most of the portraits, is reinforced by the blank uniformity of the background. And I think military uniform undoubtedly performs a prosthetic function, both in these photographs, and for the men portrayed. So the uniformity of military dress here is reinforced by the uniformity of the background. There's no suggestion of physical location, no social or familial clues, and although the accompanying chronicles of injury are personal, there is a uniformity here too. All serve to frame the visual shock, the ugliness of mutilation within a medical paradigm of injury, treatment, rehabilitation, and overcoming. As a narrative device, heroic individualism has come to dominate the popular response to unpopular wars in the 20th and 21st centuries. But the rhetoric of mending broken soldiers and the fantasy or spectre of prosthetic man was already in place during the Great War. As official photographer of Great Britain, Horace Nichols was commissioned by the Propaganda Bureau at Wellington House to make an official record of the war at home, the great munitions factories and shipyards, training camps, new recruits, and soldiers on leave. A handful of these photographs, not seen by the British public at the time, record the meticulous process of mask making in the specialist studio set up by the sculptor Francis Derwent-Wood. Facial injury was regarded by many as a loss not just of appearance, but of identity and indeed humanity. Stories circulated of children terrified at the sight of their fathers, nurses and orderlies unable to look their patients in the face, and the wounded refusing to let their loved ones visit them in hospital. In the British press, the surgical and artistic response to these injuries was hailed as nothing short of miraculous. Here we see Derwent-Wood adding the final touches to a handmade facial prosthesis. Each plate was effectively a part portrait of the patient, meticulously brought to the verge of life with the stroke of a painter's brush. Although the masks couldn't restore physical function, Wood believed they had the potential to ameliorate psychological pain and social isolation. But no matter how faithful the likeness, a painted mask could never replicate the softness, pliability, and warmth of human skin, or the expressive range of a living face. The rhetoric of restoration was one thing, but the masks served another purpose. They hid the brutal, dehumanizing consequences of modern war. And in that sense, the portrait mask enterprise is symptomatic of an unofficial censorship of the war-damaged face. The men who ended up in Derwent-Wood's Tin Noses shop are described in contemporary sources as pitiable, ruined, grotesque. The surgeon, Harold Gilles, spoke of men returning from the Somme in 1916, burned and maimed beyond recognition. He actually talks about them being reduced to the condition of animals. So humanity really is at stake here, I think, in this sort of discourse and this sort of desperate enterprise of restoration. Surgical reconstruction and prosthetic repair could ameliorate these horrors up to a point, but it's telling that there are so few images of facially wounded servicemen in the British press and propaganda. Repairing war's ravages, as Nichols captioned his photographs, remained a fantasy. In the 1920s and 30s, the rhetoric of repair was extended from war injuries to the more ordinary effects of aging and heredity. As well as legitimising aesthetic surgery, the medicalisation of female appearance in the interwar years created a market for non-surgical treatments. Cosmetics advertisements in Vogue and other women's magazines regularly featured the paraphernalia of clinical intervention: syringes, bandages, white-coated technicians, and scientific preparations. That these developments were part of a massive global expansion of the beauty industry is uncontested. Between 1914 and 1938, worldwide production more than quadrupled, and quadrupled again from 1938 to 1966. As well as being an effective marketing strategy, the medicalisation of beauty eroded the distinction between reconstructive and cosmetic surgery, and between surgical and non-surgical procedures. While becoming more beautiful was clearly an aspiration for many women, the desire not to be ugly was as if not more important. In her 2014 book, Saving Face, which examines attitudes towards disfigurement in contemporary America, the sociologist Heather Laine Talley questions the assumption that appearance-changing surgery is motivated by the pursuit of beauty. Instead, she suggests the avoidance of ugliness, the desire to be unremarkable, is often the primary motivation. Talley also points out that we talk about disfigurement as though the meaning of the term is self-evident. And yet, diagnostic criteria for disfigurement do not live in any medical text, I'm quoting Talley here, nor is there a shared collective understanding of what kinds of appearance might be deemed disfigured and what might simply be called unusual. Like normal, which shifts historically and culturally, disfigured is also rife with multiple meanings. In what sense, then, can we talk about a history of disfigurement? Instead of assembling, say, a visual archive of facial anomalies, one would need to know why human variability is perceived as disfigurement, is stigmatized, I guess is another way of putting this, at any given moment. Along with gender, sexuality, class, race, ethnicity, and other social distinctions, appearance is a powerful determinant of an individual's perceived value. In an expanded sense, encompassing cosmetics and grooming, hair and fashion, gesture and facial expression, appearance is also one of the most fluid and alterable aspects of our identity. Talley follows in the footsteps of sociologists like Irving Goffman and Pierre Bourdieu in her attention to the negotiated nature of appearance and the role it plays in social hierarchies. Bourdieu's account of the daily micro-transactions between physical, cultural, social, and economic capital is particularly salient as he illuminates the myriad and often unconscious ways in which social structures are embodied and reproduced. Within this system of exchange, physical capital, what we look like, how we dress, speak, walk, and comport ourselves, is a currency that can be converted into friendship, social influence, money, romance, services, favours, qualifications, and job opportunities. What results from these new perspectives on the body and identity, and from a new political discourse of rights in the second half of the 20th century, is the possibility, in a meaningful way, I think for the first time, of aesthetic relativism. Until the 1960s, discussions of ugliness and beauty almost always assumed the universality of these categories. Aesthetic judgments have been used to ascribe and deny value for centuries, but in the wake of the civil rights movement, dominant constructions of beauty and ugliness started to be contested as disenfranchised groups engaged with appearance politics in response to discrimination and stigma. Women's liberation, Black power, campaigns for gay and disability rights, the advent of fat activism, body positivity, and face equality, all of these movements have involved challenges to white European and American norms of physical attractiveness. While it's impossible here to do justice to the range of tactics deployed in these struggles, my few remaining examples show that ugliness and beauty can be critical and political weapons as well as personal attributes. And this clearly has profound implications for our understandings of disability, both today and in the past. At the heart of feminist debates and practices from the very beginning of the suffrage movement in the 19th century has been the endlessly fascinating and difficult terrain of the female body as material and metaphor, locus of feeling, object of intellectual scrutiny, and site of resistance. Made for the 1989 Women's March on Washington, the immediate target of Barbara Kruger's iconic image was the anti-abortion legislation threatening to overturn Roe versus Wade, a threat that American women are living with once again. Kruger was one of the first artists to use the direct address and bold visual language of advertising against capitalism's mythologies of beauty, desirability, and success. Her subject isn't the individual female body, it is gender as image and idea. Stereotype functions like a stain, she told the art historian W.J.T. Mitchell in an interview for Critical Inquiry. One of the most powerful investigations of the embattled female body as flesh and image is Jo Spencer's The Picture of Health series. Spence learned her trade as a high street photographer, having left school at 15 and taken a secretarial job in a commercial photo studio. Eventually tiring of family portraits and passport photos, she quit to become a documentary photographer, and in 1974 set up a women's photography collective, the Hackney Flashes, in East London. At a time when documentary photography was being interrogated and transformed, the Flashes devoted themselves to what they called cultural sniping, using images and texts in activism and education. In 1982, Spence suddenly had to go into hospital for tests and took her camera with her. Looking back on the shock of her initial diagnosis and treatment, she wrote about realizing with horror that my body was not made of photographic paper, nor was it an image or an idea or a psychic structure. It was made of blood, bones, and tissue. The project that eventually became The Picture of Health started out as a photographic diary of her diagnosis, treatment, and surroundings. Part of the healing process was finding a way of giving her feelings visual form. How do you represent cancer? She asks in a BBC Arena documentary in 1987. Breast cancer, which like other cancers is considered a disability under the UK Equality Act, has become highly visually mediated since the 1980s. But when Spence was diagnosed, cancer was something you hid from employers, neighbours, family members, and even from patients themselves. Writing in the late 1970s, Susan Sontag reflected that cancer patients are lied to not because the disease is or is thought to be a death sentence, but because it is felt to be obscene in the original meaning of that word, ill-omened, abominable, repugnant to the senses. Some illnesses, like tuberculosis, have historically been romanticized, not cancer. For Spence, keeping a visual record of her body, and I quote, helped me to come to terms with something I initially found shocking and abhorrent. Her self-portrait is about beauty only indirectly, in the sense that women learn to beautify themselves in order to become lovable. Serious illness exposes the cruelty of the beauty myth, which equates being unlovely, failing to maintain oneself, with being unlovable. But in this series, we see the non-beautiful being used to explore the politics and everyday experience of breast cancer. In another print, Spencer's body is emblazoned with the word monster. Like Sontag, she implies that it is the way we think about illness and disability that makes it obscene. 30 years separate the picture of health from M. Ford's video. During this period, the digital revolution has made it possible for us to take photographs of virtually anything and post them online where they can be seen by practically anyone. Hospital selfies are now a recognized phenomenon. Looking at attitudes towards physical difference across the longue durée, it becomes apparent that it isn't enough to study ideas of disability and disfigurement, beauty and ugliness. There has, in the modern era at least, been an increasing, some might say, compulsive visualization of these ideas. The observation that disability and illness are mediated by visual as well as by medical technologies seems an appropriate place to conclude. It also returns us to the question of skills and methods, the value of close observation, detailed description, and careful interpretation. Art historians are used to the idea that images do things as well as show things. We're comfortable with discussing the ideological content of representations and know very well that discourses are visual and material as well as verbal and textual. But most of us, let's be honest, are less adept at studying the social and cultural life of images, beyond matters of critical reception and artistic influence. The emotions they elicit, the human qualities they validate or stigmatize, the way visual and material culture shapes our collective desires, aspirations, and prejudices. And this, I think, could be one of the important legacies of this workshop, to bring histories of art and histories of disability into more productive dialogue. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Suzannah. That was really inspiring collection of material, and especially an appropriate end to sort of what we had done, bringing these two institutions and their collections together over the last 2 days. I'm really especially struck by your inclusion of Jo Spence, who I first encountered her work at Wellcome Collection. And I feel like she's such a powerful addition to the conversation, especially when I think always find your work really attends to how the state co-opts the male disabled body, and how that becomes such a site of sort of use and value to the state in a very cruel way often, and sometimes a very dehumanizing way. But then to bring in the presence of disabled women and health and women's bodies with Jo Spence, I feel like that's really productive. I'm just, before I sort of ask some of the questions that are at the forefront of my mind, I just wanted to let everyone know that the way we'll do the Q&A today is that if you have a question, please just use the raised hand function on Zoom, which you can find down in the reactions tab at the bottom of your screen. And Felix or I will just unmute you and welcome you to the conversation. You can ask your question just over audio or come on screen. It's really nice to see people's faces and have us at least imagine that we're around a seminar room table, perhaps, sharing this space together. So please don't be shy and come on video if you'd like to during this discussion. So yeah, I think I just want to circle back to this issue of gender that you raised and sort of ask if maybe you would just expand on that a little bit. Of sort of, it seems that the the male disabled body has all these very particular political uses or advantages to the state and to conceptions of power. But where does that leave the female disabled body, especially if we're looking maybe earlier more towards some of Susan's work with the ugly laws and these photographs, where we do see disabled women. I mean, they're obviously much rarer, but we still do see them. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that gendered aspect.
Yeah, that's I think that's really interesting, Jess, and actually it's something that I think I haven't completely thought through, but that I clearly need to think about more. But it strikes me that what you're saying is that in a way, disability, the concept of disability, is a way of recuperating certain male bodies that are, we might think of them as impaired or imperfect in some way, as not fully functional. So disability, yes, I think that's right. Maybe the concept itself has a kind of prosthetic function in relation to certain male bodies, not in every category. And you'd have to say that, if we're thinking about categories of difference, that actually disability and it's the way that it can recuperate bodies is very much determined by or inflected by other types of difference, specifically, of course, race and class, but we're talking about gender as well. So I think it might be the case that that for women, perhaps their disabilities are more likely to be thought about as well, it's interesting when I decided to use the Joe Spence example, I had to check. I thought, should I include this? It works with what I'm trying to do around aesthetics and appearance politics, but does it work for disability? I had to double check that cancer, is classed as a disability, and of course it is. But so I wonder whether female bodies are more likely to be seen as sick bodies. There's a lot about sick women and sort of femininity in relation to chronic illness, particularly. It seems to be okay. So the other person whose work springs to mind here, of course, is Jasper whose work on disability and these other categories that sort of hover around it, like debility and ability, of course. But I wonder whether, women's disabilities are more often seen as just natural but debilitating conditions. And of course, the state of, the condition of being female historically, and actually today, is one of being, sort of physically inferior. So already aligned. Yeah, okay. So that I've probably said enough in response to that, but it's a really interesting question.
Felix, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Suzannah, also from my side. This was fascinating. And I mean, as you always do, you span such a vast amount of time and issues that I feel like I have too many questions really to ask you. So I'll just choose two. I'll take the liberty of asking two questions. And one is about the notion of disfigurement. When we were preparing to introduce you, we quickly, Jess and me, discussed the connotations of that term, because I, as a non-native speaker, was not sure whether it's a derogatory term. And then it reminded me of course, of this art theoretical notion of figura, which I think is like as old as antiquity, and you find it in rhetorics, and then it comes back in like Renaissance art theory. So I was just wondering at what point it enters medical discourses and why, it has such a success maybe at the early 20th century. And the other question is about the historical depth of the sort of developments that you indicate, because of course you're also a medievalist. And some of the dynamics that you described coming from the First World War into the 20s, how this like rhetorical repair moves away from the battlefield towards beauty industry, reminded me of the 16th century, because there is a similar development, I think, because of the advancement of gunpowder. You have new injuries, and in the same moment that you find sort of like a new prosthetic devices and a kind of like aestheticization of these devices in the sense that they become more decorated. You also have the first instance of plastic surgery invented by Paduan physicians, especially with the nose repair job. So I was just wondering if this is really a new thing in the 20th century, whether there's not like a longer medical discourse about beauty that reaches back to the early modern, maybe even the medieval ages.
Thanks, Felix. Yeah, I say loads to think about there as well. But to begin with the term disfigurement, it is a really problematic term, and it's a contested term. The term that's used probably more often by well, we talk about the visible difference community. So a lot of people will prefer the term visible difference or facial difference. And yet there are a lot of people in that community who regard difference as just too broad and crucially also euphemistic, and so who use very deliberately the term disfigurement because it does have these connotations of stigma. Why? So I have started playing around with the idea of the unbeautiful, which is pretty much a neologism, partly because I think it opens up a sort of conceptual space in which we might think more expansively about the relationship between beauty and non-beauty or ugliness, but also the political uses of the unbeautiful or the non-beautiful. And it's also a way for me of sidestepping disfigurement a bit as a term that I think really polarizes people. Your question about where, when we start seeing the term itself being used, and actually I realize that I don't know. I haven't looked because I've always worked on it in the modern period. So the sort of medievalist in me actually hasn't worked on this material. I should. If anybody knows, I would absolutely love to know. I do know there's been a bit more work on deformity as a concept and as a term, and that has a much longer history. It's sort of very well-established history. It's still used as a medical term today. So again, a really problematic term. I've spoken to people who've told me how awful they feel when their consultants describe them as deformed or as having a deformity. So the figura, yes, I think also for me, as somebody who works on art history in the modern period, disfiguration is an aesthetic strategy. Think of Picasso would probably be the most famous example of this. So yes, I'm really interested in that. I don't think that connects with the sort of the cultural history of beauty and ugliness that I've been sketching out for you. In a way, I'm disappointed that it doesn't. In other words, I think you might argue that there's been a recuperation of the unbeautiful in 20th century art, the art of the avant-garde, the modernist avant-garde, but I don't think that has had any impact on how most people think about appearance.
I was really struck the last 2 days by kind of our discussions about the medieval examples of sort of disabled people being brought up again, in the Dresden exhibition and in Wellcome's collection for contemporary especially disabled war veterans, and that sort of very discriminatory anxiety over being able to work or being able to contribute within a capitalist system, being a sort of judge of value in that moment, and the sort of use of that older imagery to sort of recycle and reify that. So I was just really interested in how you brought up work and that sort of, that kind of propaganda photography, and and wondered if you see that again in the more recent military photography as well, or if they tend to be these much more isolated portrait photography that you showed.
Yeah, interestingly, I don't think that work ethic comes up in, I always think of it as Victorian. I don't know whether, I mean, probably it predates the Victorian period, but, you know, for early 20th century, that seems to be where it's coming from. You know, this really sort of strong belief that work is redemptive, that, you know, that rehabilitation is going to be partly through work, through labor of some kind. And reintroduction into a workforce. So the sort of retraining of veterans with disabilities is something that goes on, you know, I think pretty much everywhere. So what you'd see in the contemporary imagery of disabled veterans is not that so much as a real kind of interest in the therapeutic journey. So that process of rehabilitation, and that is a kind of work as well. But I use the term overcoming, and I think that's generally the message there. We see that certainly around elite Paralympic sports, which interestingly, you know, also very much involve competitors who've had a military background and who have combat injuries. So that sort of rhetoric of repair, which is both surgical and prosthetic, and also emotional, psychological. It's you know, that seems to be something that people are very interested in.
I wanted to ask a question about when you brought up this sort of development of statistical ways of registering sort of normalcy, because it just, I don't know, so the immediate thing that sparked in my head as a sort of medievalist and early modernist was Albrecht Dürer's drawings of anatomy and the body and sort of, you know, regulating the body. And I think there's been a lot of, you know, really productive you know, work that you mentioned, for instance, in sort of fat theory and sort of working against these constructions of constraining and the body. But I just wondered if you just speak a little bit more about that statistical moment and sort of, yeah, what you see there that maybe art history has not engaged with from the conversation around sort of statistical normalcy and eugenics and that sort of dangerous moment.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm examining a PhD at the moment, which I won't say very much about, but because the Viva's on Monday. But one of the things, one of the claims that's made there is that art historians haven't engaged in the statistical revolution, like almost at all. And I thought, oh wow, is that the case? Surely not. But actually, I think this might be the case. So this is about, I mean, actually, I also recently heard a fascinating talk by Silvia Cassini, who works on digital imaging. And she is an example of an art historian who works on film, who really is engaging with data. But it's rare. It's really rare.
Yeah, but that seems to be sort of, because I just found it interesting the way you positioned the word normal and normative, and that I feel like that's very helpful for us also, not only in thinking about the recent history that you covered tonight, but in thinking also about the deeper past and sort of removing some of our assumptions that we arrive at with these sort of categorizations. Obviously, those periods have their own categorizations, but I just found that really interesting of sort of how you pinpointed that word.
And it's not, so I always feel like I slightly sort of gloss over that because I don't, I don't have a background in statistics, and frankly, I find it quite difficult to understand. You know, even when Leonard Davis is talking about the statistical revolution, I have to really concentrate to follow his arguments. And I think this might be one of the problems with, generally with art historians and this massive shift, which is actually, so in Silvia Cassini's work, she points out that with medical imaging technologies, of course, we think we're seeing portraits, but we're not. We're seeing data that's been visualized in certain ways, but it's so hard to see those images as anything other than portraits, because, you know, portraiture is the sort of paradigm that we sort of live with. We completely internalize it. Whereas what that data is showing us is probabilities. You know, it's an image of probability, but that's such a foreign concept.
Yeah, that is. Yeah. Felix, would you join us?
Yeah, I have like one final, like very short question. It's also about these Adams photographies, which reminded me kind of this this discourse a year ago, 2 years ago, when Trump wanted to introduce classicism back into American public architecture. And sort of this is, I don't think the background, but I find these pictures very problematic in the sense that disabled people, you know, into the service of this like monumentalizing aesthetic that you find in public places. So I was just wondering how the disability community reacted to them and evaluates them, because on the other hand, I often find myself in the place that some aesthetics that I find problematic, people with disabilities actually appreciate. So I was wondering about that.
Right, and that's a great question too. And one of the things that I've found, one of the lessons that I've learned, is that there is huge disagreement, you know, not surprisingly, in the disabled community, which, as we know, isn't one community. But even just thinking about the facial difference community, which I have had a little more contact with over the years, yeah, there's huge disagreement. And so some people find those images really empowering, and other people find them very disempowering because of the implicit message that, you know, that you can overcome, or that you might want to overcome. And of course, we can't all be elite athletes, you know, as much as we might want to be. That is just not going to happen for most of us. Yeah, so yes, no, so I think probably big disagreements, and maybe what I feel like what I need to be more sort of attentive to is the terms of those disagreements, which often don't happen in public. So often there will be more of a sort of impression of consensus, you know, coming from disability advocates or activists than there actually is in reality. And the only other person who kind of popped into my head in relation to what we've just been discussing and prosthetic man is, of course, Amy Mullins. I did have an Amy Mullins slide that I took out. Amy Mullins, with her, you know, famously an athlete as well as a model, you know, has fashion prostheses, an amputee, has done TED Talks. And one of the really interesting things about her, so you could say that she is an example of a woman who conforms to this, you know, otherwise quite masculine trope of prosthetic man. And she's very sort of sexualized as well. But it's almost a sort of techno-fetishistic thing going on with those images of Mullins. But you don't ever see her without her prosthetic legs. And that's, you know, and she talks about, you know, the fact that she doesn't see herself as somebody with a disability. She thinks she's, you know, her prosthetics make her, you know, sort of give her super abilities, make her more able. Other athletes talk about, you know, their prosthetic legs in the same way. But yeah, the sort of vulnerability of the visible stump is something that I think is sort of really apparent through its absence in these images of, you know, idealized prosthetic embodiment.
Well, I think unless anyone has a last pressing question, I think we might thank Suzannah and let her have her Friday evening. and let all of you return to your lives. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. And it's really thought-provoking material to attend to, especially over this long durée. And a huge thanks again to the Warburg Institute for generously hosting this lecture and the other 3 earlier this year, which we hope you will go seek out on the YouTube channel. So thank you all so much for joining us. And we hope you stay well this season.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Suzannah.
Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic questions. I've made loads of notes. Lots to think about. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.